In the ancient forests of northern England, where the mist clings to the earth like forgotten memories, there existed a village called Thornwick. The year was 1847, and the villagers spoke in hushed tones of something that dwelled in the woods beyond their borders. They called it the White Hobbit, though it bore no resemblance to the cheerful creatures of children's tales. This was something older, something that predated the very stones of their church, something that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms and remained unchanged, patient, eternal. The story begins with Thomas Blackwood, a cartographer sent from London to map the uncharted territories of the northern wilderness. He arrived in Thornwick on a November evening when the sky hung low and gray, pressing down upon the earth with an oppressive weight. Thomas was a man of science, educated at Cambridge, skeptical of superstition and dismissive of folklore. He carried with him leather-bound journals, brass instruments for measurement, and an unwavering belief in the supremacy of reason over myth. The village in where he lodged was a cramped establishment that smelled of damp wood and smoke. The innkeeper, a weathered man named Garrett with eyes that had seen too many winters, eyed Thomas with undisguised concern when he announced his intention to venture into the Blackwood forest to complete his survey. "Sir," Garrett said, his voice barely above a whisper, "no map is worth your soul. That forest, it belongs to something else. Something that was here before the Romans, before the Celts, before memory itself. We call it the White Hobbit, though the name does it no justice. It appears as a small figure, pale as bone, with eyes that reflect no light. But what it truly is, no living soul can say with certainty." Thomas dismissed the warning with a patronizing smile. He had heard similar tales in every remote village he had visited. Superstition was the refuge of the ignorant, he believed, a way for simple minds to explain the natural world they could not comprehend. He retired to his room that night, studying his maps by candlelight, planning his route through the forest with meticulous precision. The next morning dawned cold and colorless. Thomas set out before sunrise, his pack laden with supplies, his compass hanging from a chain around his neck. The forest entrance was marked by two ancient standing stones, covered in moss and inscribed with symbols that predated any written language Thomas recognized. The villagers had left offerings at the base of these stones, small bundles of dried flowers, carved wooden figures, and what appeared to be locks of human hair tied with red thread. As Thomas passed between the stones, he felt a subtle shift in the air, as though he had crossed an invisible threshold. The forest beyond was dense and primordial. Oak trees of enormous girth stretched toward a sky barely visible through the canopy. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves that had mulet over centuries, muffling his footsteps until he moved through the woods in an eerie silence. For the first few hours, Thomas worked efficiently, taking measurements, sketching landmarks, and recording observations in his journal. The forest was unremarkable by his standards, just another wilderness waiting to be cataloged and understood. But as noon approached and the already dim light began to fade further, he noticed something peculiar. The forest had grown absolutely silent. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the air still and heavy. It was then that he saw it for the first time. At the edge of his vision, perhaps 50 yards distant through the trees, stood a figure. It was small, no more than 3 feet tall, with a shape that was vaguely humanoid, but somehow wrong in proportions Thomas could not immediately identify. Its skin was pale, almost luminescent in the forest gloom, and it stood perfectly motionless, watching him. Thomas called out, assuming it was a child from the village, who had followed him into the woods. His voice died quickly in the still air, absorbed by the forest. The figure did not respond. It did not move. It simply watched with an intensity that Thomas could feel despite the distance between them. Annoyed but not yet frightened, Thomas began walking toward the figure, intending to send the child back to the village with a stern warning. But as he approached, weaving between the massive tree trunks, the figure seemed to recede at exactly the pace he advanced, maintaining the distance between them without appearing to move at all. It was as though the forest itself was expanding, stretching the space between them despite his forward progress. Thomas stopped, his rational mind struggling to explain what his eyes witnessed. The figure remained stationary again, watching. He could see more details now. Its head was too large for its body, and its limbs too long and thin. Its eyes were dark hollows in a face that might have been carved from pale stone. There was nothing childlike about it at all. A primal fear, older than civilization, older than language itself, began to uncurl in Thomas's chest. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee back toward the village, but his pride and his education held him in place. He was a man of the modern age. He would not be frightened by shadows and tricks of light. He turned back to his work, deliberately forcing himself to focus on his measurements, on the solid reality of numbers and angles and distances. But he could feel the figure's gaze on his back, constant and unwavering. When he glanced up from his instruments, it had moved. Not walked or run, simply moved. It now stood in a different position, closer but off to his left, still maintaining that impossible stillness. The afternoon wore on, and Thomas found his hands beginning to shake as he worked. The figure appeared again and again, always at the periphery of his vision, all eyes watching, always closer. Sometimes it stood behind trees, only partially visible. Sometimes it appeared in clearings ahead of him. Once, he looked up to find it standing on a thick branch directly above him, its pale form crouched and impossibly balanced, its hollow eyes staring down. As the light began to fail and evening approached, Thomas admitted defeat. He would return to the village, he decided, and resume his work another day, perhaps with a companion or a local guide. He consulted his compass to orient himself, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on any direction. He tried to retrace his steps, following the marks he had made on trees, but the forest seemed changed, unfamiliar, as though the paths had rearranged themselves when he was not looking. Panic, real and undeniable, flooded through him. He began to run, crashing through underbrush, his careful scientific detachment shattered. Branches tore at his clothes and face. He fell, picked himself up, ran again. And always, at the edge of his vision, the White Hobbit followed, moving through the forest with an ease that made his own desperate flight seem ridiculous by comparison. Night fell like a curtain dropping. The darkness beneath the forest canopy was absolute, impenetrable. Thomas stumbled blindly forward until he collided with something solid, a rocky outcropping or perhaps the base of a massive tree. He huddled there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the darkness, he heard movement. Not footsteps exactly, but a sense of displacement in the air, of space being occupied that had been empty a moment before. He fumbled for his tinderbox with shaking hands, managed to strike a spark, and in the brief flare of light, he saw it. The White Hobbit stood less than an arm's length away, so close he could have reached out and touched it. Its pale skin was not skin at all, but something that resembled fungus or bleached wood, textured and unnatural. Its face was a nightmare of wrong proportions, eyes too far apart, a mouth that extended too wide, features that suggested human but achieved something utterly alien. And those eyes, those terrible hollow eyes, reflected the spark of his tinderbox with a light that was not reflection, but something emanating from within, cold and ancient, and utterly devoid of mercy or recognition. The spark died. Darkness returned. Thomas screamed, a sound of pure animal terror that the forest swallowed without echo. He scrambled away, his hands and knees scraping over stone and root, moving blindly through the night, no longer caring about direction, caring only about distance, about escape, about survival. How long he fled through that darkness he could never say. Time lost meaning in the absolute black of the forest night. He ran and fell and crawled and ran again, until his body was a mass of cuts and bruises, until his lungs burned with every breath, until his mind began to fracture under the sustained terror. And then, impossibly, he saw light ahead, the warm glow of firelight filtering through trees. With the last of his strength, Thomas ran toward it, and burst into a clearing where a small fire burned. Around the fire sat 3 figures, and Thomas's relief at finding other human beings was so overwhelming that he nearly wept. The figures turned to look at him, and Thomas's relief curdled into fresh horror. They were not human, or they had been human once, but were no longer. They had the same pale, fungal quality to their skin as the White Hobbit, the same wrong proportions, the same hollow eyes. But they were larger, adult-sized, and they wore the rotted remnants of clothing from different eras: medieval tunics, Tudor-era doublets, Victorian frock coats. They were not eating or speaking or doing anything that humans do around a fire. They simply sat, motionless, watching him with those terrible eyes. Thomas backed away slowly, and as he did, he realized the clearing was not empty except for these figures. The ground was covered with stones, and carved into each stone was a name and a date. Graves. Dozens of them. Hundreds perhaps, stretching back into the darkness beyond the firelight. And the dates? Some were recent, within the last few years, but others went back centuries, a chronicle of the lost and the taken, of those who had entered the forest and never emerged. Among the gravestones, other figures moved. Some crawled on all fours like animals. Others stood swaying, their movements jerky and unnatural. All had that same pale, fungal appearance, that same sense of being human-shaped but fundamentally other. And Thomas understood with a clarity that shattered his sanity like glass that this was what the White Hobbit did. It did not simply kill. It transformed. It took those who ventured too deep into its domain and made them part of the forest, part of itself, part of something that had existed since before humanity crawled out of caves and learned to fear the dark. The figures around the fire stood in unison, their movements synchronized with eerie precision. They began to advance toward Thomas, and he ran again, plunging back into the forest, away from the clearing and its nightmare inhabitants. Behind him, he could hear them following, moving through the trees with that same impossible ease, neither fast nor slow but inexorable, patient, certain. Thomas's mind began to break under the sustained horror. He found himself laughing, a high, desperate sound that he barely recognized as his own voice. He spoke to himself in fragmented sentences, reciting facts from his education, mathematical formulae, anything to anchor his dissolving sense of reality. But the forest pressed in on all sides, and the pale figures followed, and the White Hobbit appeared again and again, always ahead, always watching, herding him deeper into the woods like a shepherd with its flock. Dawn came eventually, though Thomas had lost all sense of time. The gray morning light. Tea filtered through the canopy, and in that light, Thomas saw something that gave him a desperate spark of hope: the standing stones, the entrance to the forest. He was close to escape, close to the village, close to safety and sanity, and the rational world he had taken for granted. He ran toward the stones with the last reserves of his strength, his body pushed far beyond exhaustion. The pale figures followed, but did not close the distance. They seemed content to watch his attempt at escape with patient, hollow-eyed interest. Thomas reached the standing stones and passed between them, and as he did, he felt that same subtle shift in the air, that sense of crossing a threshold. He emerged from the forest and collapsed on the road leading to Thornwick, gasping for breath, his clothes torn to rags, his body covered in cuts and bruises and filth. Behind him, at the edge of the tree line, he could see them, dozens of pale figures standing just within the shadow of the forest, watching but not pursuing. The White Hobbit stood at their center, small and terrible, its hollow eyes fixed on Thomas with what might have been curiosity, or hunger, or something else entirely, something for which human language had no name. Villagers found him there hours later, half-conscious and delirious. They carried him back to the inn, where Garrett the innkeeper tended his wounds, and listened to his fevered ravings with sad, knowing eyes. Thomas spent 3 days in bed, swinging between fever and lucidity, haunted by nightmares of pale figures and fungal skin and eyes that reflected light from within. When he finally recovered enough to speak coherently, he demanded that Garrett explain what he had encountered in the forest. The innkeeper sighed deeply, and poured them both whiskey before beginning his tale. "The White Hobbit has been here longer than this village, longer than England itself," Garrett said. "The old ones, the people who lived here before the Saxons, they knew of it. They left warnings carved in stone, stories passed down through generations. It is not a creature, not in any way we understand. It is something older, something that exists in the places between, in the wild spaces where human law and human understanding hold no sway." Garrett explained that the forest had always been forbidden territory, that every generation lost someone who ventured too deep, drawn by curiosity or greed or simple foolishness. Those who entered and returned spoke of the White Hobbit and its pale congregation, of being hunted and herded, of graves hidden in clearings and figures that had once been human but were no longer. "What does it want?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Garrett shook his head. "It does not want in any way we can comprehend. It simply is. The forest is its territory, and those who intrude become part of it, transformed into something that serves its purpose. What that purpose might be, no one knows. Perhaps it has no purpose beyond existence itself. Perhaps it is simply the nature of that place, a wound in the world where reality is thin and something else seeps through." Thomas remained in Thornwick for 2 more weeks, recovering his strength and trying to make sense of his experience. His journals from the forest were gone, lost during his desperate flight, but he found he could not bring himself to return for them. The thought of entering that forest again filled him with a terror so profound it made his hands shake and his breath come short. Before he left to return to London, he stood at the edge of the village, looking toward the dark line of trees on the horizon. In the daylight, from a distance, the forest looked ordinary, almost inviting. But Thomas knew better now. He knew what watched from within those trees, patient and eternal and utterly alien to human understanding. He returned to London and attempted to resume his life, but he was forever changed. He could not explain to his colleagues or his family what had happened in the forest. The words failed him, and when he tried to describe the White Hobbit and its pale congregation, he sounded insane even to his own ears. He resigned his position, unable to venture into wild places anymore, unable to trust his own perceptions of reality. Years passed. Thomas aged, grew gray, developed the habits and routines of a solitary man haunted by memories of horror. He never married, never traveled, never strayed far from the gaslit streets of the city where civilization's veneer could provide some illusion of safety. But in his dreams, he returned to that forest every night, pursued by pale figures through endless darkness, always running, never escaping, while the White Hobbit watched with its hollow, knowing eyes. In 1873, 26 years after his encounter in the Blackwood Forest, Thomas died in his sleep. His landlady found him the next morning, his face frozen in an expression of terror, his hands clutched at his throat, as though he had been choking. On his nightstand was a letter, written in his own shaking hand, addressed to no one. The letter described his final dream. He had found himself back in the forest, standing in that clearing with its graves and its pale inhabitants. But this time, he was not running. This time, he stood still and looked down at his own hands and saw that they had taken on that familiar fungal pallor. His skin felt wrong, no longer his own. The White Hobbit approached him, and for the first time, it spoke, though not with words, but with images placed directly into his mind. It showed him the true nature of the forest, a place where the barrier between worlds wore thin, where something ancient and vast pressed against reality like a face against a window. The White Hobbit was not a creature but a manifestation, a physical presence of something that existed beyond human comprehension. The pale figures were not victims, but extensions, new cells in a vast organism that sprawled through dimensions humans could not perceive. And Thomas understood, in that moment of dream revelation before his death, that escape had been an illusion. From the moment he passed between those standing stones, from the instant the White Hobbit's hollow eyes had fixed upon him, he had been marked, claimed, slowly transformed over decades despite the distance between himself and the forest. The changes were subtle, invisible to others, perhaps even to himself, but they were inexorable. In his letter, Thomas wrote that he could feel it happening now, could feel his self, his identity, his humanity dissolving like mist in morning light. He was being called back, pulled across the distance between London and that northern forest, his consciousness being drawn into that vast and alien presence like water flowing downhill. The final lines of his letter were barely legible, the handwriting degrading into something that resembled letters, but was not quite language. I understand now. We never leave the forest. The forest is everywhere. The White Hobbit is patient. It has all the time in the world. And in the end, we all return to the source, to the beginning, to the place before separation, before self, before the terrible burden of individual existence. I can see it now, so clearly. The trees are not trees. The earth is not earth. Everything is. The letter ended there, mid-sentence, the pen trailing off the page. Thomas's death was recorded as heart failure, unremarkable in a man of his age. His few possessions were sold to cover his debts. His letter was filed away with his papers, unread by most, dismissed as the ravings of a dying mind by those few who did encounter it. But in the village of Thornwick, in that ancient inn where Garrett had long since been replaced by younger innkeepers, who told the same warnings to travelers who did not listen, the story of Thomas Blackwood became another thread in the tapestry of tales about the White Hobbit. Parents told their children about the London man who went into the forest and returned changed, who lived in fear for decades before the forest finally claimed what it had been owed. The forest remained, patient and primordial, and the White Hobbit continued its vigil, standing among the ancient trees, waiting with hollow eyes for the next curious soul to pass between the standing stones. Sometimes, on nights when the mist rose thick from the ground and the moon was hidden behind clouds, villagers claimed they could see pale figures moving at the forest's edge, neither approaching nor retreating. Simply watching the warm lights of human habitation was something that might have been longing or hunger or alien curiosity. New graves appeared in that hidden clearing, though no one from the village ventured deep enough to count them anymore. Hikers and tourists sometimes disappeared in the area, their fates never conclusively determined. Search parties found nothing. The forest kept its secrets. And the White Hobbit remained, a constant presence in the darkness, a reminder that for all humanity's progress and understanding, there are still places in the world where ancient things dwell, where the rules of civilization and reason do not apply, where something older and stranger than human comprehension waits with infinite patience for those foolish enough to cross the threshold between the known and the unknown. In the depths of the Blackwood Forest, where light barely penetrates and time moves differently, the pale figures continue their existence, serving purposes beyond human understanding, extensions of a vast and alien consciousness that predates humanity, and will likely endure long after the last human has turned to dust. They do not hunger, do not sleep, do not dream. They simply are, as they have always been, as they will always be. And somewhere in that congregation of the transformed, a tall figure in the tattered remnants of Victorian clothing stands watch, its once human eyes now hollow and reflective, its face bearing the faintest suggestion of what it had been before the forest claimed it. If one could look closely enough, if one could bear to meet that terrible gaze, one might see in its features a distant echo of Thomas Blackwood, cartographer, man of science, who ventured where he should not have gone and learned truths that no human mind was meant to comprehend. The forest whispers with wind that is not quite wind. The White Hobbit watches with eyes that are not quite eyes. And the boundary between the human world and something else remains thin, waiting for the next curious soul to test its limits, to pass between those ancient standing stones, to discover too late that some territories cannot be mapped, some mysteries should remain unsolved, and some horrors are patient enough to wait decades, centuries, millennia for their inevitable claim. In the villages surrounding the Blackwood Forest, the warnings continue, passed from generation to generation, though fewer people listen with each passing year. The modern world has little patience for old superstitions, for tales of pale figures and hollow-eyed watchers. Science has explained so much, illuminated so many dark corners, that people have forgotten there are still some shadows that light cannot penetrate, some questions that should never be asked, some places that belong to something other than humanity. And in those forgotten places, in the wild spaces between civilization's bright islands, the White Hobbit waits, patient and eternal, ready to teach the same lessons it has taught for countless generations, ready to transform the curious into the transformed, the seeker into the sought, the human into something that wears humanity like an ill-fitting coat, but is fundamentally, terribly other. The story of the White Hobbit has no ending, because some stories do not end. They simply wait, patient as stone, for the next chapter to begin, for the next soul to venture into the darkness, for the next transformation to unfold. And the forest keeps its secrets, and the pale figures watch from the shadows, and the cycle continues, ancient and inexorable, a reminder that for all our progress and understanding, we are still small creatures in a vast and mysterious universe, surrounded by things we do not comprehend and perhaps should not seek to understand. The standing stones remain, covered in moss and ancient warnings that no one can read anymore. The forest grows thick and dark beyond them. And somewhere in those depths, the White Hobbit stands watch, its small pale form barely visible among the trees, its hollow eyes reflecting a light that comes from somewhere beyond this world, waiting with the patience of eons for the next curious soul to cross the threshold and discover what waits in the darkness between the trees, in the spaces between worlds, in the realm where the White Hobbit holds dominion and human understanding fails. This is the tale of the White Hobbit, told in whispers around fires, written in letters never sent, remembered in nightmares that persist long after waking. It is a warning and a promise, a map to territories that should remain uncharted, a story that has been told in different forms for as long as humans have gathered in the light to speak of what lurks in the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights, when the wind moves through distant trees and civilization seems very far away, you might hear it, the whisper of the forest, the call of something ancient and patient, the invitation to venture beyond the safety of the known world into realms where the White Hobbit waits, eternal and watching, ready to welcome you into its pale congregation, ready to show you truths that will shatter your understanding of reality, ready to claim what it has always claimed from those who venture too far into the wild places where it dwells.